Hello everybody, welcome to Coding 101. My name is Kutla, and in today's video, we're going to be exploring much more deeper into the React component lifecycle. We're going to be touching on some of the bits that we didn't cover in the previous video. If you haven't watched the previous video, I advise you to do so before watching this one. We're going to be going in much depth. We're going to be doing some examples so that you can understand really what is this React component lifecycle. But before we continue in this video, once again, I would like to encourage you to make sure that you subscribe to this channel, make sure that you leave a comment in the comment section, make sure that you like this video. We drop awesome videos like this to help you become a better developer, to help you become a professional and proficient developer. I promise you that once you watch our videos and you attend to each and every videos that we make, I promise you that once you begin watching our videos, you are definitely going to become a better developer and a better programmer. So without wasting any much of your time, let's get into our video today. Like I said, we're going to be going into much more deeper, and we're going to be getting into a much more deeper level of understanding the React component lifecycle, because mainly what we will be doing today is that we will be doing some examples with React, live examples, so that you can understand most of the methods in the React component lifecycle phases. So like I already mentioned in the previous video, that components can be created as functional components and class components. So this is a very, very important, because in today's video, we're going to be doing using our examples. We're going to be doing our examples using the class components, because the class components illustrates much more clearly our React component lifecycle methods. In the previous video, I did mention to you, or I did explain to you about some of the life cycles of the different phases in the life cycle of React.js component. And I did explain that, like a human being, a component has a series of stages that it goes through from its initialization phase to its unmounting phase, which could be likened to the death phase in the life cycle of a human being. We have the initial phase of a React component, which is similar to a birth phase in a human being. So this is essentially the birth phase of a React component lifecycle. And then we have the mounting phase. The mounting phase, in this phase, the instance of a component is created and inserted into the DOM. And the updating phase, in this phase, this is whereby we probably get new props and some sort of change happens. And this is where changes occur. And the unmounting phase is whereby the component is being removed or destroyed or unmounted from the document object model. Now, before we continue in our lesson, I want to explain to you the key thing about understanding this React component lifecycle. And the secret to understanding it is understanding your DOM, understanding the document object model. So the document object model is a very important concept in order to understand the React component lifecycle. And I'm going to just give you a brief of what the document object model is. It is simply a representation of your HTML elements. So it's a tree-like structure that sort of represents your elements or your UI elements. And in our case, it's going to represent our components. So that's document object model. So you have your document over here, and then it's represented in like a tree-like structure. And these nodes over here represent different UI elements or different components in our case. So maybe we have component A, and then we have component B over here. So every time we create an element, or every time we create a component in React, that component is added or inserted into the document object model. And that's what our phases are all about. Our phases surround the phases of a component lifecycle are all about the document object model. The time whereby we insert a component into the document object model, and the time we remove a component from the document object model, and actually updating this DOM. So it's very important for you to understand the DOM. So now we're going to be talking about the different phases of the document object model. But before we do that, actually, I want to explain to you what mounting is and what rendering is. So we have this DOM over here. We have the document object model over here. And now we want to add a component to the document object model. So that is actually a process that is called mounting. So we have a component over here. So now the actual process of actually adding a component into our node, and let's say maybe we want to add component C into our document object model. So this process by its own is called mounting. And the process of actually getting rid of a component or an element in our document object model, getting rid of an element like this, and destroying it or taking it out of our document object model is called unmounting. So just to recap, the process of adding a component or a UI element into our document object model is called mounting, and the process of removing our component or a UI element out of the document object model is called unmounting. And now, the actual process of taking this HTML element that we have represented in this document object model all the HTML that we have here. Sorry, it's a little bit messy, but this is all encompassing of the HTML elements that we have represented in our document object model. Taking this HTML and representing it with UI in our browser. Say, for example, maybe this is our PC over here, and we take this HTML and we represent it with UI in our PC. This process on its own is called rendering. Now that we understand rendering and we understand mounting and unmounting, now let's put things into perspective and try to better understand how the React component lifecycle works. I'm going to just get rid of all of this. All right, and now we are going to start from the beginning and try to understand the React component lifecycle phases one by one. So at the very beginning, a component is created. This is our component, and we're going to call it component A. Now, in order to display that component, the first thing that we need to do is that we need to insert or mount that object. Now, in order to display this component that we have over here, then that means we need to insert or mount that component into our document object model. So we have our document object model over here. Just going to try and construct something. Maybe it might probably have an existing component already inside of that. I'm going to use a different color now. So the next step after creating the component, we need to mount the component inside of the document object model. So our component will be over here. So remember, this is component A. We've just mounted it. And then along the way, we might decide to update our component. Maybe give it a brand new color. So those changes need to be reflected. I'll use a different color for this. Those changes need to be reflected as well in the document object model. So maybe now we want to change our component. Maybe we want to change the color, the background color of our component. We no longer want to give it an orange. We want to maybe use a green. So this is a stage called updating. It's still our component A. And maybe along the way, we decide that maybe we want to get rid of our component. And we want to remain with the components that are already there. All of this needs to be reflected in our document object model. And now we've gotten rid of our component, and we now have the component that we had previously. So all of this all represents the different phases or the lifetime of, or the life cycle of a component. This is the beginning stage. It's called initialization, or the initial phase. Over here, we have the point at which the component is being mounted to the document object model. So this is the mounting phase. And over here, we have a situation whereby we are now updating the existing component. So this is called the updating phase. And then we have a phase whereby we are now getting rid of the component. So we are essentially unmounting it from our document object model. So this process is called unmounting, and this phase is called the unmounting phase. So under each of these phases, there are several methods that can be rendered. There are different methods that can function in or be invoked rather under these different phases. They're called the React component lifecycle methods. We have a method called component will mount. So this component is invoked before a component is inserted into the document object model. So you will probably put a couple of methods in here that will run before a component is mounted into the DOM. And there's another method called component did mount. This is a method that is invoked immediately after a component is mounted into the DOM. And there's also a method called component did update. And this type of a method over here is the kind of method that is invoked immediately after a component is updated. And then we have the final method called component will mount. And then we have our final method called component will unmount. If I could write it over here correctly. Let me try and write it over here. Component will unmount. Write that correctly? Okay, cool. And then this method is invoked immediately before a component is destroyed and unmounted permanently. So what it essentially does, it performs any necessary cleanup related task. For example, invalid timers, event listeners, canceling network requests, cleaning up DOM elements if a component instance is unmounted. So once a component is destroyed or is unmounted, you can't mount it again. That's the final part about that component. So what we're going to do is that we are going to look at all these individual methods, and we're going to take up some examples so that to better help you understand how all of these methods work. So we're going to go to our Visual Studio. We had already created a Visual Studio. Let me just get rid of this. We had already created a Visual Studio, a React application, sorry. We had already created a React application, and here we just created a component, a file, and we called it class a.js. And what we're going to do is that we're going to create a class component, and we're just going to do this. At the very top, we're just going to write constructor. We're going to create the constructor, and I'm going to call super, and then we're going to do state. And inside the state, we have a message, and the message will read as hello world. The first thing that we're going to start off with, of course, is component did mount and component will mount. But over here, I'm going to just make an indication of our app. I'm just going to each one. I'm going to say component lifecycle. And the first thing that we're going to start with is component will mount. And I'll console log this. Right. Then after that, we're going to also do component did mount, which is a much more popular, and component will mount. Make our console log over here. The reason why we have a console log over here is just that I want to show you the order in which these methods are invoked. Did mount. And now we're going to go back to our application over here. I'm going to refresh this because we have to put this in our app.js. Here, called class A. And then once it's done compiling, I'm going to go to my console, and you can see over here, component will mount ran first, and then after that, component did mount ran again. And the reason why this is so is because, as I showed you on this example, component will mount is invoked before a component is mounted into the DOM, while component did mount is invoked after a component or an element is mounted into the DOM. So these are two different methods that run at different intervals. Now, this tells us that we can't actually, when we come over here, we can't do any DOM operations. And I'm going to tell you why we can't do any DOM queries is because the DOM has not been set up yet. So the best thing to do is to run your DOM queries over here. So let's say, for example, we want to manipulate or we want to use this element over here. We can't call it over here because it's not yet connected to the DOM. We can't say document.getElement by ID because that element, this element over here, is not yet inside of the DOM. So you can't make a DOM query until that component is inserted into the DOM. So the best thing to do is to run your DOM queries under component did mount and not component will mount. But nonetheless, component will mount has been phased away by React, and React advises that you do all your methodology, everything your network requests under component did mount, and avoid the use of component will mount. Now we're going to move on to something else. We're going to move on to component did update. And what we're going to do with component did update, we're going to go to our Visual Studio file, and we're going to call or invoke component did update. So you can see that all these different methods in the React component lifecycle are invoked at different intervals. So it's very important that when you're running your functions or you're running any methods within these functions, that you know where you are running these functions, whether it's appropriate or it's not, because you might be running something that needs you to use DOM queries, and that's going to crash your app. So component did mount, remember that it is a method that is invoked after an update has been done to your component. So what we're going to do is that we are going to attach a state, our state object over here, and we're going to take this message and we're going to put p over here, p tag, and we're going to just say, put curly brackets there, we're going to say this.state a message. But now what we want to do is that we want to create a button which will allow us to change that message to something else. In fact, you know what? Instead of changing the message, how about we create another state in here, and we're going to call it count. We're going to give it 0. And what's going to happen is that every time we click this button, count is changed. So instead of putting our message over here, we're going to use count. I'm going to say count. It's going to be this.state count. And after we're done, I'm gonna create a method that is going to increment our count. So I'm gonna call it increment. And in here, we're just gonna say on click. And what this is gonna do is that it's simply going to increment our count. And in order to do that, we're gonna say this.set state, and we're gonna come in over here, and we're gonna say count is equals to this state.count plus. Or plus 1. I don't want to make it too complicated. So every time we come over here and we press +1, what's going to happen is that our count state is going to increment. So because our state is incrementing, so that means that our component is changing. Hence, our component is being updated. So this function over here, component did mount, is going to be invoked because it's going to detect that our component is being changed. Something is changing in our component. So now remember that component did mount detects any changes that are being made to your component. And if it detects that there are changes that have been made to your component, this function right here, component did mount, is going to run whatever is inside of it. So what we're going to put in there, we're just going to put a simple console log statement, and we're going to just say component did update to indicate that this function has been invoked. What we expect is that every time we click our button and we increment the state, then our component did update function is going to be invoked respectively. We're going to go to our app. There's our increment. Now pay attention to the console, and we're going to increment. And would you look at that? Every time we increment, our component did update function is being called just like that. Every time we increment, it detects if our component is being changed. And every time our component experiences an update or a change, then component did update is invoked. And now the next thing that we're going to do is that we're going to explain or experiment with component will unmount. Now remember, component will unmount is a function that is invoked once a component is unmounted or removed from the DOM. Once a component is unmounted or is removed from the DOM. So we go to our application and we come over here and we're going to call component will unmount. Do just like we did the others. Say console.log component will unmount. That should suffice. And the next thing we're going to do is that we're going to this one is a little bit tricky because we need to find a way to get rid of this component. And what we're going to do is that on our app.js, we're going to create a state with use state. I say const. And we're going to control the visibility of our component. And the Boolean statement. So we're first going to say true. We're going to say every time this visible is true, then I want you to display class A. But every time visibility is not true, I want you to destroy this element. I want you to take it out of the document object model. So now, in a sense, we are controlling the existence of our class A component. Yeah, let's say visible, and this is what we do. We're just going to take our class A, put it over here. So whenever visible is true, then class A will also be true. So now what we're going to do is that we're going to create a button over here, which is going to toggle that visible state. So what we're going to do is going to set visibility to false, thus destroying the component or unmounting it from the document object model. So what we expect to happen is that every time we come over here, or whenever we click this toggle button over here, what it's going to do is that it's going to set our visibility to false. And if it sets our visibility to false, then that means that this class A component is going to be removed from our document object model, hence triggering this function over here, component will mount. That's what we expect to happen. Let's see if that will happen exactly. But before we do that, we need to save our app and then go to our browser. So what we expect is that, but first let's refresh this so that we have a clean console. So now what we expect to happen is that every time if we were to toggle this, you can see that component will unmount has been called because we've just gotten rid of our component from the document object model. So you can see that every time we get rid of our component from the document object model, then the component will unmount function is invoked. So let's just refresh our page and try to do that again and see what it will do. You can see we have our component over here. Now we're going to press toggle, and then we expect the component will unmount function to be invoked in such a manner. So I think that's about it today for today's lesson on the React component lifecycle. Please remember that if you have any questions or you would like clarification on anything, I'd be happy to do so. Leave your comment in the comment section. Make sure you like this video. I will see you next time on Coding 101.